3,
two
1
على البنش
or
on the bench with ايريك هيلمس. للشباب اللي قاعدين يتابعون على على المنصات السمعية، الحلقة هذه مترجمة على اليوتيوب. We're just saying if you don't know how to speak or read or listen to English, you can watch the episode on YouTube. We'll have the translated version there. Hello, Erik Helms. How are you?
What's up? I'm great. Better now that I get to be with you two gentlemen.
Thank you. Can we have a small introduction about yourself? We're big fans. We know a lot about you, but maybe our viewers don't know that. So give us a small introduction about you.
Absolutely. I am an athlete, first and foremost. Probably a meathead is probably a better way to put it, because I'm not sure if bodybuilders and powerlifters are quite athletes. But yeah, I've been lifting weights for almost 20 years now. I started in 2004, got bit by the iron bug as it helped me through a tumultuous time in my life. And then it moved from an obsession to eventually a personal pursuit, eventually to a career. I became a personal trainer in 2005, so only 1 year after starting lifting. So I absolutely thought I knew everything. I knew nothing. But then I've dedicated the last 18 years to trying to learn everything I possibly can. So if we fast forward to now, I finished my PhD in 2017 here at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. I'm from the States, but I moved here for my graduate school. I did a second master's also at Auckland University of Technology, and now I work here as a research fellow in both the strength and conditioning as well as the sports physiology and nutrition research groups, where I get to kind of pay it forward and help other interested meatheads who are way too nerdy for their own good. Along the way, I also started a research review along with some colleagues of mine called MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, or I guess just MASS Research Review now. We're rebranding a little bit now that we have like Kleenex, like we're that important. Like we just mean something, MASS. You know, we don't even need an acronym anymore. Prior to that, I co-founded along with my colleagues 3D Muscle Journey, which is a coaching service and information provider, course provider for drug-free strength athletes and physique athletes. And I've also written a couple books on the topic, the muscle and strength pyramids, and now I do the iron culture thing with Omar Isuf. So my whole mission statement is to try to educate, act as a science communicator, science promoter to the lifting community. And I am, like I said to you guys, I think off air, first and foremost, an athlete. And I said that on air here. I'm actually 8.5 weeks out from a natural bodybuilding show. And I just competed in my first meet as a 40-year-old in powerlifting here at North Islands in New Zealand. Just, I want to say 3 or 4, maybe 5 weeks ago. So yeah, still doing the damn thing, doing some limited coaching. I'm not a full-time coach anymore like I used to be, but my primary role with 3D Muscle Journey is to support the coaches, being the chief science officer. So that was probably too long of an introduction.
Oof, quite the resume.
Yeah. You look young for 40 years old.
That's the dieting. Yeah.
That's the diet.
If you just diet off all your face fat, then there's nothing to be wrinkled. So it's good.
And I think you didn't have to mention that you're preparing for a competition. It's already clear with the jawline and stuff.
Yeah, he mentioned that.
Yeah.
So
It's true.
It's already there.
That's like the right timing to talk about this episode. In this episode, we were talking like about natural bodybuilding, how to prep for it, what are the difficulties that you will encounter in terms of prepping for a natural bodybuilding. Like at the beginning, we'll talk about natural bodybuilding. A lot of people don't know that exists. Most people know that bodybuilding shows are only for people that are enhanced or people that use drugs. So if a guy like me who's natural, like I want to compete at a natural bodybuilding show, where should I go? What are there like federation for it, or just should I go with the enhanced people?
Great question. Yeah, you know, the funny thing is that for many people in the modern era, at least, just like you said, bodybuilding was something they became aware of before natural bodybuilding. Natural bodybuilding has really only existed since the late 60s. which is right around the time that anabolic steroid use became much more prevalent in the lifting community. And it's only gotten more prevalent since then. So there was no need to have, natural bodybuilding federations in the, early 60s, 50s, and prior to that, because there weren't anabolic steroids. At least there weren't anabolic steroids outside of, small clinical trials and hypogonatal clinics and being used for other purposes. So once anabolics hit the bodybuilding scene, people figured out they worked, and Mr. Olympias kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The need for creating a different version of the sport for people who didn't want to do that, but still wanted to do all the things that, people have loved about bodybuilding since the 1890s needed to exist. So, if you're lucky enough to be living in the United States, and these days I'm not sure if that's actually something to be lucky to have been doing, you have a ton of different options for where you want to compete as a natural bodybuilder. There's as many acronyms as you can think of: the INBA, the INBF, the NGA, the OCB, the IPE. All day long, I could be saying these things. But in other countries, you are limited. To my knowledge, probably the most ubiquitous organization that has the most international affiliates, that is most widespread and probably the most legitimate. If there's an IPF of natural bodybuilding, that's the INBF WNBF. So that's the World Natural Bodybuilding Federation, International Natural Bodybuilding Federation. When you go to WNBF Worlds, which is held every year in November, it's actually a true world's event these days. There's more international competitors than there are US competitors, and that's typically not the case for some of the other organizations that are out there. The difference between a natural bodybuilding organization and a regular bodybuilding organization is just the presence of drug testing. And depending upon the federation, that can either be some combination of urine testing, polygraph testing, the quote unquote lie detector test, and occasional blood testing, and maybe even some limited off-season testing. And those things are all expanding depending upon the federation you compete with. So the shows I'm doing are all INBF, WNBF, because I do think it is arguably the most competitive and most serious, or it was among the most serious federations for being natural. So to get on stage, you need to take a polygraph. So you meet with a polygrapher, typically have a background in policing, and used to do it for a police department, and they will go over the banned substance list with you. So you're aware of what you're not allowed to take, which includes basically any and all prescription and illegal drugs for bodybuilding, either performance enhancing or aesthetics enhancing, if you will, as well as a lot of drugs that are legal, or supplements that are legal, depending upon your location. So in many places you can buy anabolics in a pharmacy, and that's true of multiple places around the world. And even in places where anabolics are illegal, or they're scheduled, or you can only get them as prescription, you can often buy things like SARMs or some, although this has changed a lot, pro hormones over the counter. Some stimulants are banned that are little like kind of meth clones. So anyway, you take this polygraph test. If you pass, then you can get on stage. And then, like any other bodybuilding show, the goal is to move up the different rankings. And typically that occurs by winning your class and then going on to win the overall. And if you win the overall in a INBF show, that's the amateur affiliate in the States, and you can have that as an amateur in overseas under the WNBF flag. That's World Natural Bodybuilding, International Natural Bodybuilding Federation. If you win the overall, typically, if it's a big enough show, you can get what's called pro status, or a pro card. And if you're in that position where you're actually getting a pro card, then you're also urine tested on top of that to make sure that they're doing everything they can. Drug testing isn't perfect, but ultimately you do what you can, and you create as level playing field as you can. So between both the polygraph and the urine test, if you pass both of those, you're awarded a pro card, and then you can compete as a pro against other people who have taken it that far. And in those shows, you have to both polygraph and urine test regardless of your placing. And they are instituting some limited blood testing, and sometimes they will do, I'm going to say, off-season testing, not random testing, because typically what happens is they will test people in the audience who they know are with the federation, pros or amateurs, when they go to another one of the shows. So for all the people trying to cheat, you just need to taper off when you want to go hang out at a show next time, and you're good to go. I'm
So,
kidding. I think there's very few cheaters.
so the real question always is, and we get this on social media a lot. Is it really natural? Is it really drug free? Or some people can like go around the system?
Because like in the last scene, like I was seeing some WMBF shows, and like,
Crazy.
it's crazy. Like, can people reach to that potential? Is it like, are we doing something wrong, or the genetic pool is just right now so huge that people can reach that limit naturally?
You have to ask yourself a few questions. The first one is, how cynical and insecure am I? And if the answer is I'm extremely cynical and I'm also very insecure, then it's an easy answer. Everyone who looks better than me is on drugs. We've been taught that by most people on Reddit, and then you're good to go. You can always feel good about your accomplishments. I think the more critical thinking kind of answer is to think, all right, what are these folks rewarded? What are the rewards in place to cheat? How do we compare these folks to the enhanced ranks? And what other options do they have if someone wants to pretend to be a natural bodybuilder? Because, that can help you in terms of social media influence. There's certainly reasons, right? So to answer the first question, what's the benefit? Well, if you were to turn pro and win every single pro show in the WNBF, you'd probably barely be able to pay off your flight tickets, the cost of hotels, and drug testing, because drug tests actually cost something. And then you'd be losing money from actually taking the drugs. So it would be a very financially costly endeavor. You're only going to win 10 grand if you win Worlds. It's not like winning the Olympia where you get $100,000 or something like that. I haven't looked at the recent prize money. You get more placing 10th in the Olympia than you would winning every single show and qualifying for the Olympia than you would in natural bodybuilding. And you're paying for drug tests, you're paying for flights. Also, there's very few sponsors. There's very few natural bodybuilders who actually have paid sponsors. They have sponsors like, hey, I'll send you some creatine. And you're like, sweet. But if you're taking drugs, you probably don't care that they send you creatine because you're taking drugs. So anyway, doesn't make a whole lot of sense financially or from the rewards. You're also not getting as much clout. Most people don't know who won WNBF Worlds outside of the natural bodybuilding community. So it's a whole lot of work to get very little reward or a jumping off platform. If you want to just do this as a career move, you want to be Arnold, the move is, go be enhanced, right? So that's the answer to number one. Number two, I forgot the order if I said these, so I'm going to do them out of order. Number two is, are there other options? And yeah, there are organizations billed as natural that don't have a polygraph in place. A lot of them just do urine tests, which allows you to have a much simpler path to cheating. There's less hoops to jump through. No test is perfect, and I don't think anyone should pretend that's the case. I said quote unquote lie detector. There's a reason why most legal systems don't accept polygraphs, is because they have issues. But I think they're an excellent deterrent. And I think if you were going to try to cheat and get into a natural show and you had one option of taking a polygraph and another show where you just had to take a urine test, you're probably going to do that one. So I think that's something to consider as well, that there are so many natural bodybuilding federations, not necessarily in every country, but if someone really does want to cheat and pretend to be a natural bodybuilder, the smart play is to go to a place that's easier to cheat. There's places that urine test everybody. There's places that polygraph everybody and then urine test the winners. There's places that just randomly urine test some people, So it's unsurprising to me that if you look kind of at the stage weights and the physiques in these different federations, sometimes you see at the highest level, like pretty big people in shows that are a little less strict in their testing. And the third one, that's right. And I did this out of order. It's what kind of stage weights are we looking at here? So the heavyweight division in, say, the INBF, the amateurs, is like 190 pounds and over. And most of the time, the people in the heavyweight division in an amateur show are tall and out of shape. So they could be lighter, and they're generally pretty tall. Most natural bodybuilders are on the male side. They're competing between like 140 to maybe 190 pounds if they're pretty tall. Like someone who gets a lot of accusations, for example, Doug Miller, who's an excellent natural bodybuilder from just the prior generation. He is, I think, 5'9", 190 on stage. that's big. I mean, it's really big. Don't get me wrong, but I know that like we know there are other natural bodybuilders who are bigger than that. It's the thing that makes people incredulous is how he looks.
Yep.
Yeah.
And just like where your attachments are and the way things look and they're shaped on your body, we have to think critically here. Did drugs change where your muscle bellies insert? Did drugs change the shape of your muscles? No, they just make you bigger, right? So I think anyone who's been involved in elite sport, like I have as a coach, especially, like in strength conditioning and sports nutrition, especially if you worked in like the US with like Division I athletes or in Olympic settings, man, the stuff you see, it just blows your mind. Some guy who barely like skips breakfast, comes to practice, weight trains twice per week. He's 19. He doesn't even understand that you actually have to inject steroids to like you talk to him, it's like clear he's not educated, nor does he have the access to this type of thing. And he's 6 foot, 8% body fat, 230 pounds, and not really trying. And that's like most Division I football players, and only like 10% of them are able to make it into the NFL. So
Damn.
I think once you start to see genetic variation and you start to realize that, as there's more popularity behind these things and just how many millions of billions of people are on the planet. And I think even when you start to study the history, I think that's what really changed my mind and made me less cynical. Like, for example, just being exposed to John Grimmick, who is, when you look at pictures of him he went to the 36 Olympics as an Olympic weightlifter. He won the Mr. America in 40 and 41. And then they made it the John Grimmick rule where you can't keep competing in the Mr. America, go to the universe because you're never going to stop winning. And this guy's 5'8", 210. He's not as shredded as they are today, but he's certainly not 20 pounds over stage weight. And you're like, all right, that was literally before most dictionaries had the word testosterone in them. I would have to be a hardcore conspiracy theorist to think he was somehow on drugs. He would have to be, have access to chemical labs in Switzerland in the time when transatlantic flights didn't exist, also speak other languages, and know more than the chemists themselves who'd isolated testosterone, and then somehow figured out how to make it at scale and inject himself. It's like, okay. So also back then there was like half the number of people on the planet, right? And gyms were so rare that like you would have to travel hours to get to them. This is like, if you think it's a counterculture now, 1930, bro, come on. So I think it's just, we have to acknowledge that someone like Kai Green, Sean Clarita, Ronnie Coleman, if they were drug free, people would think they were still on drugs because they're that good. And in fact, we actually know those three examples I chose were on purpose. So Kai Green had won almost every WNBF pro show by the time he was 19.
Really?
He wasn't getting enough of a challenge, so he decided to get on the gear. And he got his pro card at the Team Universe. He turned IFBB pro. And that's actually one of the few drug tested shows. It's changed now. It's like the natural path to a pro card, the Team Universe. Typically those guys, whoever win the overall Team Universe, they get their pro card, and then they just don't compete as pros. They do it for one time.
There's
so Kai Green.
There's this. Sorry to interrupt. There's also this pictures of Phil Heath and Chris Bumstead when they were younger. Phil Heath when he was doing basketball. He looks crazy.
Jacked. Like seriously.
Yeah, like, I don't even think he was lifting weights for basketball back then either.
That's it.
That's right. Yeah, that's his tricep extension is shooting at 1 pound basketball, right? So anyway, I'll finish this story pretty quick because I've been giving you a really long answer to a short question.
That's all right.
But I liked it. But a lot of people just don't believe it, right? You see the physique, so I like to really kind of walk them through the logic that's taken me years to come to, so that they can, honestly assess it and maybe change a very strongly held belief, which often is that, these guys are all cheating, right? So Kai Green gets his pro card, and he's like, I think 210 or something like that.
Mm.
And Kai Green then puts on 60, 70 pounds at his peak to compete. And I'm no expert on steroids, but there's not a whole lot you can do to gain 70 pounds of muscle from drugs unless you're just going from not taking them to taking all of them, right? And we actually see a very similar story with Ronnie Coleman. if you talk to a lot of the retired pros from that era, and you also look at his pathway to get his pro card. So Ronnie Coleman actually won world championships, which is the international pathway to an IFBB pro card. It's actually a drug tested show. They randomly urine people. Not everyone, most people try to get around the test because that's their international pathway to the IFBB pros, but it actually is drug tested. He gets his pro card at like 215 pounds. Okay. Claims natural. The people who know him claim he's natural. You talk to Brian Dobson at Metroflex. I talked to him. He didn't want to use steroids initially. He claims he's natural. And these are people who will absolutely say, yeah, and then he's on drugs. There's no real motivation to lie. They're retired. Who cares, right? They benefit not at all from saying that this guy who whooped their ass was drug-free. That makes them look even worse, right? So Ronnie Coleman, he's like 5'10", 5'9.5", 215 pounds, gets his IFBB pro card. And then he spends years placing, I think it's in the early 90s. He doesn't win the Olympia until 98. And he's, kind of walking around in the 215, 220 range, and he's placing like 8th, 9th as a pro. And then, a little later in the 90s, something happens. And eventually, we're talking in the early 2000s, he's up to 296 pounds on stage. So once again, what is going to put 80 pounds on a body that is already taking a bunch of gear? Nothing. So you have to think like, there are the freaks out there. Sean Clarita was the lightweight WNBF Pro World Champion. He was battling it back and forth with Brian Whitaker for many years in the mid 2000s. And then he decided to go enhanced. And now he's the 212 Mr. Olympia, and he competes in the high 170s. So he competed at about 130 pounds. So again, much shorter, but the same story. Like, if you're already cheating, are you going to put on 50 pounds of muscle just from upping the dose? Not if you talk to anybody who knows anything about anabolics. So I think it's important to point out that the people who are at the top of the IFBB now, some of the greatest legends, arguably someone who's an uncrowned Mr. Olympia, Kai, and then the greatest Olympia of all time, Ronnie Coleman, and then the greatest 212 Olympia of all time, Sean Clarita. Two of them actually competed in the WNBF, and they used to get accusations back then, but then they really got on the sauce, and people were like, "Oh,
damn."
So I think now all this is not to say that there aren't cheaters. People do get caught. People do fail the tests. I've talked to Bob Bell, who's the head of the WNBF, about it. It does happen, and of course they're fake naturals, but it doesn't mean that the vast majority are lying about it. I think it's far more likely that your average influencer who doesn't compete, isn't tested, and is trying to sell you something rather than just be an athlete who doesn't want to take anabolics is probably lying to you than it is that some random WNBF pro who only has like 500 followers on Instagram. Because most of the WNBF pros are not famous people. They're not influencers. They work in a random gym as a trainer, go home to their wife, train really hard, eat, and they're competing 100 pounds lighter than the top pros at the same height as them, in the IFBB. So I would, if I had to guess, and of course this is just a guess, I would say that more than 95% of the WNBF pros are actually drug-free.
I feel like this question was very close to Erik Hart. He was just like laying everything, because I think, do you go through your social media? This is a side question from me, like the comments, the DMs.
Yeah.
So probably you get a lot of this question, like about is this guy natty or not? So I feel like you had all of this, like, all right, I had to explain in details, because we get this as well.
Yeah, like how can you maintain all these muscles while you're 40 years old? Oh, he must be on TRT.
Yeah, like even for Muhammad, because he's like deadlifting 320, 330, and they're like, he must be on something. This is like unnatural strength. So like even in powerlifting as well, they get this accusations. So I think we want to get some of your expertise, especially because you're a scientist and physiology and all of these training things. So we want to talk about the technicalities of the natural bodybuilding as well.
Yeah. So we can start with this question. Like, when can someone participate in a natural bodybuilding show? Like, let's say that this guy started going to the gym. I was like, okay, this is the time that I can actually prep for a bodybuilding show. Is there like specific body weight or specific years that he starts from, or what?
I mean, anybody can do it. You could literally just not even diet and just rock up, and you're going to have to probably register a few weeks prior, because unlike an untested show where you just compete on the day if you want, buy your membership to the organization and compete, you'd have to sign up a few weeks earlier so you can schedule your polygraph and all that. And you could, be that guy at the show. The one guy who doesn't diet and looks a little weird, like why is he doing that? Now, when should you compete is a different question. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that getting into shape for a bodybuilding show is a very rigorous process. Getting that lean, most people underestimate how much body fat they're carrying and how lean they have to get to look proper in a bodybuilding show, and how little muscle they actually might have if they've been kind of underestimating their body fat percentage this whole time. The average person on the internet who thinks they're 10%, it's probably 15 or 16%. The average person who thinks they're 15 or 16% is probably a body fat that starts with 2. And if we're talking males. So I remember the first time I dieted down, just kind of do like this is 2006 or 5, I can't remember which. And I wanted to do like a little trial run because I knew I wanted to compete in 07, do my first season. And I was walking around at 220, and I still had like my top 4 abs. I didn't really understand back then that I just don't store a lot of body fat on my abs. So I was like, well, if I have abs, all the magazines say I'm 15% body fat. And I tell you what, guys, at 220, even today, now with that many training years behind me, I'm still not 15% body fat at 220 pounds or 100 kilos. So I remember I was 220, and I was like, well, if I lose 20 pounds, I'd probably be like pretty much in stage shape, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to lose that much. I'll just lose 10, 15 and see what I look like. So I dieted 25 pounds off. I got down to like 196 or something like that. And I was like, I think I'm still 20 pounds over stage weight. So I literally had I thought I had more than double the amount of fat on my body that I thought. And then sure enough, the next year in 2007, my stage weight was 176 or 178 pounds. So just under 80 kilos. And I wasn't in stage condition. I looked appropriate for stage, but I didn't have striated glutes or split hamstrings. I had everything else. And, fast forward all the way till now, my stage weight is still about 80 kilos, but it's shredded. So building muscle naturally takes time. And I think all of that also, there's a big mental stressor as well. And you have to be okay with that. So I think mentally, there's a lot of perspective you need to have. A lot of the typical bodybuilding message of you're adding your body weight all the time and you're going up and up and up and up and up. That needs to be reconsidered, and understanding it's like fine tuning and refinement. Even if you do everything right, you're probably going to be building most of your muscle in the first 7 to 10 years. And then after that, you're going to spend the rest of your life putting on a little bit more, although you will look better and you'll get better at the dieting process, better at posing. You'll bring up weak points, but it won't necessarily result in massive scale weight changes. And I think that can be a mental struggle if you're not prepared for it. So I think mentally, a lot of prep needs to go into before you decide to actually compete. You want to have a really good relationship with food and your body. You don't want to get into bodybuilding because you don't like the way you look. But you're always moving towards something positive. It needs to be, the way you view your body should be separate from your competitive physique. If a lot of people get into lifting weights because they want to be more attractive to the other sex, or they don't like the way they look and they want to do a transformation, I think you really need to look at bodybuilding as a sport, or it can get kind of tied into your social views of yourself and your self-worth and beauty, and then it can really wreck your life, to be honest, straight up. So I think, I view getting shredded and bringing my best physique on stage in 2 ways. One is kind of an artistic pursuit. So it's not about attractiveness to me. It's about aesthetic beauty, like a Greek statue. And trying to, I think the human body in a muscular form is a really interesting, the way it looks, it's very cool. It reminds me of superheroes, mythology, etc. So it's the opportunity to express myself artistically, right? And that's different than going, oh, am I attractive to people? It's not attached to my security as a person, any of that. It's this artistic expression, and bodybuilding has always been partially art. And then also I view it as the same thing as throwing a 90 mile per hour fastball, or running a under 10 meter second 100 meter sprint, getting yourself to the point where there's literally zero visible body fat on you and you can see every striation. That's a athletic pursuit, right? It's not your self-worth. It's not your attractiveness to society, any of that. But it's very difficult to create those separations. And I think people need to think about that intentionally from the start, because a lot of people will go, oh, you know what? I've lost 100 pounds. That's awesome. Let me just take it all the way to the stage. This will be my transformation opportunity, and I can have these cool before and afters. And I think that's great, but I don't necessarily think that competing is a perfect fit for that. And you have to be very careful. So having a good relationship with food, a good relationship with your body, having trained a number of years so that you have a solid foundation of muscle mass, so that it's not mentally stressful to diet down and realize that you're actually higher in body fat and lower in muscle mass than you thought. And then also taking enough time. The traditional way of dieting for a bodybuilding show is like 12 weeks. It's also important to point out that many anabolic steroid cycles from the 80s and 70s, 60s lasted 12 weeks. It's not a coincidence. You're a natural bodybuilder, so you're not just going to jump on a cycle and diet and recomp and look amazing in 12 weeks and crash diet and not lose muscle because you're on gear. You have to think about this from a physiological perspective. And as you get leaner and leaner and leaner and leaner, there's only so much adipose tissue, body fat, that you can liberate and turn into energy to replace that deficit. And if you try to diet too fast, you're just going to get really, really depleted and lose muscle. You're going to look stringy on stage, and that fat will go, but it will come with muscle. Most natural bodybuilders at a high level who get into good condition are dieting somewhere between 5 to 7 months. And if you see them dieting less than 5 months, it means they're typically pretty lean in the off season. They kind of have like a naturally low body fat. So that means there's a lot of thought that goes into before you get on stage. It shouldn't just be like, hey, I look pretty good, and I did a cut in the summer, maybe I just keep going. Like, you want to make sure that you've solidified your behavioral component and your nutrition. Bodybuilding should be a lifestyle, and then you're planning this out probably a couple of years in advance so that you can set up your off season. And then also you need to think about the recovery process, because most people, the first time they compete, it turns into a true, nearly diagnosable binge eating disorder fest afterwards. My first season in 2007, I put on 22 kilos in 3 months because I just had no anticipation coming from as being a skinny kid, just how much the rebound can be. I didn't feel the sensation of hunger for 3 months, and I didn't get the sense of satiety. I felt the sensation of hunger nonstop for 3 months, and I didn't get the sensation of satiety from eating. So that can be something that if you're not prepared for it, you don't have a game plan. My only plan was a list of restaurants. That didn't go well. I mean, I succeeded. I did hit all those restaurants up. Don't get me wrong, but it was it created a lot of depression, and it can erode your self-efficacy. Going through bodybuilding is an amazing thing. You're like, wow, I have so much self-control. I'm manipulating my body. I feel like I have so much discipline. I proved to myself that I'm actually a lot more capable of doing hard things than I thought. And then the next thing you know, you can't stop eating donuts, and you're like, what happened?
And pizza as well.
Once you remove that goal, and pizza, and everything, and donuts on pizza, and pizza on the donut. So, yeah, I think it's really important to have true informed consent before you go into bodybuilding. Know what you're getting into. Know what the costs are, and many times they can outweigh the benefits.
The interesting thing is that's something that happens to our society here in Saudi Arabia. Is when I go to the gyms, it's just people get into the gyms, stay here for like 1 to 3 years, and they say, okay, I want to be a bodybuilder. It's just something that it's in their plan. Like, you don't have to be a bodybuilder. Like, some people have these standards to have, like, I want to be balanced physique, I want to be shredded, I want to be, and it's like something that they insist upon themselves, which is something not for everyone. I see a lot of people like in our gym, they just like waste all their life for bodybuilding. They invest so much money in it, not in terms like, not even natural bodybuilders, even enhanced bodybuilders, and they don't even have a plan for it. Even in enhanced bodybuilding, IFBB Pro, like, the return from it is not that much. Like, people think of it, it's just, I want to get my IFBB Pro card, or I want to be WMBF.
Then what?
Then what? What's the goal? There's something have to be like aside from it. Is it a hobby? Okay, if it's a hobby, does it affect your life? Then it's not a hobby. Is it like something that you generate money? do you have a plan to generate money? Like, I'm pretty sure, like, if you see like Chris Bumstead, if he doesn't have all that like social media, like brand supplements, everything like that, he will not continue doing it. Like for you, Eric, I think you're doing it more like something that you like doing, but you're not gonna make it affect your life, which is something that I want people to understand, because I can see people get into this body dysmorphia thing because of stuff that, like, it doesn't really matter to them. Like, I see people say, my left back is not as my right, but do people outside of the gym area actually care? Will you go to a bodybuilding show? Is that something really important to you? Like, sometimes I see it as this way when I see people like going to the gym as a lifestyle to improve their health, to gain some muscle mass, and they're like, I have to be a bodybuilder. It's like gyms are not meant for only bodybuilding.
100%. I think what you're saying, Mo, is that you need to have a really strong why. You need to know not just what to do and how to do it, and not just have a goal that sounds like, oh, this is challenging. You know, like it's that's cool. You know, like, hey, I want to climb Everest one day. You know, and I think that's fine, and you should be prepared for that as well. You need to know how hard that is, and you want to get a good Sherpa and be prepared and train for it and all of that. But if it's just something to put on your bucket list, bodybuilding is not a good fit for that, because it has consequences. You know, you go to the well and it gets you. You know, like it's not just a one-time off experience. You might have some good pictures, but you're also probably going to have some trauma, because you're getting to a level of leanness that's typically only seen in people with anorexia. You know what I'm saying? And you're dieting yourself to the point where you are, you know, so you guys, I don't know if you guys have heard of REDS or RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. You've probably heard of the female athlete triad, which is the idea of, you know, when you take a female athlete who has an eating disorder, low energy intake, and they can also have, you know, losses in bone mineral density. Basically, this is caused by just not eating enough for your sport and your activity levels relative to your body mass. And all the symptoms are everything that bodybuilders describe in prep. And it's a fixable syndrome. You know, you just simply have to eat more. And it's very common in weight class restricted athletes. You see it in powerlifters sometimes, because they're trying to maintain a very low body weight for a weight class to maximize their strength in that weight class. You'll see it in athletes who benefit from a high power to weight ratio, like sprinters, marathon runners, endurance athletes, jockeys, you know, because the lighter they are, the less the horse has to carry. It's very common. In bodybuilders, it's not just common, it's pretty much required, because your body does not want you to get to the point where you are, you know, 5-6% body fat for a man, or 10%, 11% body fat for a woman. But that is what is rewarded on stage. It's not just something that might help your performance. It is your performance, or a large component of it. And, you know, you talk to sports dietitians and they'll say, hey, you know, the most important thing for REDS is prevention. It's not an option for us. You don't get to prevent a low energy intake if you want to compete in bodybuilding. That's just preventing getting in shape. You know, you can get down to like maybe 9%. You know, you can hang around your lower settling point, and you can make sure you can, okay, I never want to feel bad. I don't want to see my performance dip in the gym. And that's actually great for recreational bodybuilders. You know, the lowest body fat you can healthily maintain. Awesome. But that's not the sport. The sport requires you to go to a place that's actually temporarily unhealthy, even in natural bodybuilding, to get on stage. You know, when you see a man's butt and it looks like a rib cage, that's not normal. And you can kind of get this immediate sense of like, yeah, this is pretty extreme, even natural bodybuilding. And that is there's a cost to that. The lethargy, the dieting, all of that. And even when you get really good at it, like it feels so much easier for me now in 2023 than my first season in 2007. But because I'm better at managing that stress, but there's still the stress. And I think for first timers especially, that can be a real shock. So if you're going to do something that hard with consequences, you bet your ass you need to have a really strong why. You need to have an entry strategy, and you need to have an exit strategy. And if you don't, you can really run into some issues.
Since we are talking about getting in shape,
just wait a second. because we didn't write it in the subtopics. I think it's important to have it
Yeah.
beforehand. We're talking like in the bodybuilding natural world, like you'll have like the off season, you have the on season. Let's say that the off season would do like the bulking, and in the on season we'll do the cutting. Like in terms of the off season, bulking. Majority of it will be bulking. Sometimes you'll do some cutting just to reduce your body fat a bit. But I'll talk about my my thing that I do in terms of bulking, and you can elaborate on it. Like what I do, like a lot of people when they do cutting, it just there's amount of percentage that you don't exceed, so you don't lose muscle, and that's a healthy way to do it in terms of cutting. And bulking, like I see people that do it and treat it like cutting. Okay, I'll increase that amount of body weight every week, which is something I find wrong. In my opinion, what I do just add a bit of surplus, let's say 200 to 300 calories, or maybe up to 500. Your body start to rise, and it just maintain. And I stay at that maintain weight until I see a stall in performance and stall in progression, and just up the surplus a bit. What do you think of this strategy? Is it good, or just maintain a surplus, maintain a progression and body weight no matter what? Or is it like there is an amount of body weight rise that you aim every week?
Well, Mo, you mentioned that it is your opinion that people shouldn't be gaining weight really, really fast. And I would say it's also backed by data. We have a number of studies now, and we're actually just in the process of having a study we did here at AUT in peer review. It should be getting it on the preprint server soon, which I'll share, where you compare different groups trying to gain weight at different rates or different sizes of surpluses. There's a study by Garth et al. I think it's actually pronounced Gartha. They're Scandinavian. Ina Garth. I apologize for Americanizing your last name. But anyway, they had athletes who were going on a bulking phase, and they were either instructed by sports dietitians to get into a pretty large surplus, or hey, do this on your own. The goal was to gain weight. And these aren't bodybuilders, so they didn't get into a huge surplus, right? They're like athletes. And they did like an upper lower split on top of their sports training, like typical kind of hypertrophy training, right? And the group that was instructed by sports dietitians was eating 600 calories on average more per day than the group that was not. And they gained about 5 times as much weight, and it was all body fat, the amount more than the other group. The other group just gained slowly. And the only differences between groups was in performance, only significant differences. And I think the 40-meter dash and the jump height was worse in the group that gained a bunch of weight because they weighed more. But all the other differences were non-significant. They were leaning a little bit in favor of the group that gained more weight. Like if you looked at the lean body mass, it was non-significantly higher. Strength was non-significantly higher. But it really didn't seem worth it, So there is absolutely a limit to how much muscle you can gain in a given time period. And it's related to how much training experience do you have? How close to your genetic ceiling are you? How effective is your training? And what does the quality of your diet look like? But for the most part, I typically don't recommend people gaining any faster than say like 1% of body weight per month, and a more novice maybe as fast as 2% of their body weight per month. But we're talking someone who's been lifting less than 6 months in that case, because based on the data we're soon to publish, when you try to push it faster than that, you're accruing. You might be gaining a little bit more muscle, but it's way outpaced by the amount of body fat you're putting on top of it. So it's typically not worth it unless your goal is to just put on size, regardless of whether it's of the composition. Like maybe you're a American football lineman and you just need to be bigger, so it's harder to push you over, and you want muscle and fat. Or you're a sumo wrestler, or you're a equipped powerlifter who benefits from just their body stretching out the equipment. A lot of super heavies will be like, yeah, I put on body fat and I get stronger. So I mean, for certain performances, yeah. But for a bodybuilder who has to eventually diet all that off, putting on too much body fat actually makes their next season harder. So it pays to be a little more conservative. And that's exactly what I generally recommend is a smaller surplus the closer you are to your genetic ceiling, and just kind of nudging up those calories. because it's also difficult to gauge changes in muscle mass, right? When you're gaining muscle slowly. And there's a lot of things that get compiled into the body weight that you see on the scale first thing when you step on in the morning. If you have higher fiber diet, higher sodium diet, more water, if you had your higher carbs that day, if you just had more weight of foods but the same amount of calories, your body weight will fluctuate 2-3% on a day-to-day basis. Now, if you have a very consistent diet, that can help, but ultimately, I'm normally, when I'm coaching someone or if I'm modifying my own nutrition and my goal is to gain weight, I take a 2 or even 3 week average, like a rolling average. A really great app for that is Happy Scale. It can kind of give you this rolling average body weight over, like, gives you your 10-day high, your 10-day low, and a corrected body weight. You can also just make Excel spreadsheets for this or Google Sheets. But anyway, looking at like a 1 minimum 2 preferably week average and comparing averages week to week to week and seeing it go up just like 0.5%, because if you gain 0.5% of your body weight every week, that's 2% per month, which is kind of like the fastest you'd go. So it requires patience, and it requires kind of changing your mindset if you've been reading like enhanced bodybuilders' social media posts or what's normal on that side of the fence, because you don't have the same help. And trying to gain muscle faster than that is probably going to it'll put the weight on, but it won't be necessarily weight that you want.
Let's say that I put a plan to go on an off season and start bulking. Let's say like for 3 years. I'll just bulk for 3 years. The only reason that I will cut in that off season is that I'm not okay with how my body looks in the mirror. That's the only reason. Let's say that I'm okay with that. I'll just keep bulking, keep gaining muscle for 3 years. I don't care how my body looks. Is there a reason to cut down body fat? Because we hear that, when you, I just put an Arabic word there.
When it gets intense, your gears just keep shifting to Arabic.
So let's say like when you gain a lot of body fat, some people say your inflammation rise up. So this will make it a bad environment for muscle building. So let's say, okay, when I gain to 30% body fat or 25%, I should cut down weight to have better muscle building. Is that truth, or just the better way is just to keep bulking and not waste time on cutting?
I think it has much more to do with what your eventual goal is, right? It's the rare person I run into who's kind of in the bodybuilding mindset who isn't going to eventually cut. And it becomes increasingly difficult to gauge whether you're putting on muscle mass the higher your body fat gets. It's hard to tell the difference between 25 and 26% body fat. It's a lot easier to tell the difference between 11 and 10% or 13 and 12, So unless you're someone who doesn't actually have bodybuilding goals, you just have goals like I talked about before to get bigger and you don't care if it's body, like I want to get more scale weight, muscle and fat, and more weight on my lifts, then you're probably going to want to cut anyway. I don't think one should be too focused on theoretical issues like inflammation or things like that. They should be focused on actual values. So if you're going to push your body fat up into the 20s and 30s as a male, I would suggest getting regular blood work. If your cholesterol numbers are staying in check, triglycerides, fasting glucose, HbA1c, like if all that's good, then you're probably fine. A lot of like some people will say this, even in the evidence-based community, that, oh no, you want to keep your body fat low because of inflammation or aromatization, and testosterone will go down and estrogen will go up. A lot of that is extrapolation from data that's really not relevant. Like if you look at people with obesity, that is true. They typically have higher inflammation levels, but they're typically not resistance training. When you start to look at people who are lifting weights, that actually fixes a lot of that. So adding activity fixes a lot of those issues. And this is a parallel that you see in studies on people who are older. When you look at older adults and they have anabolic resistance, you're like, oh, you need a higher protein dose for older adults. Doesn't seem to be true if those older adults have been training for a long time. That 50-year-old who lifts weights is a lot more similar to a 20-year-old who lifts weights than it is to a 50-year-old who doesn't lift weights. which is the beauty of training. So I would say focus on objective markers of health rather than theoretical potential issues of health if you're going to push your body fat that high. And then think about logistical things. Like if the goal is to get on stage 3 years from now and you're going to bulk for 2 years straight at a fast pace, you better spend that whole last year dieting because you're going to have a lot of body fat to lose.
Yeah.
It probably makes a little more sense to kind of have an upper limit to how high you let your body fat get, and then you do like a mini cut. So I do think typically what this looks like is you bulk for 6 months, cut for 3 to 4 weeks, as long as you're not going too fast, and then kind of rinse and repeat so that you kind of hit this upper threshold. Like let's say your stage weight, I'll use myself as an example. I compete at 80 kilos, right? So if I want to start a diet, I probably don't want to start any heavier than the low 90s. Any more than that, I'd set the diet for too long. I have to get too hard and I get a little more fatigue and I might lose any muscle I gained in the off season anyway. So that means, in the course of trying to put on more muscle, because I've been lifting for a while, it's going to take some time. I need to think about, well, how heavy can I get before I can do a mini cut? So like my upper end limit might be say 95, 96, maybe as high as 98. Because then I know within a month of a mini cut, 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks at most, I can bring it back down to the low 90s. And then I can start that process again. And then I just need to time my last cut somewhere maybe a couple months before I start my contest prep diet. And then after that last cut, I'm not going back into a surplus. I'm just eating at maintenance, letting myself fully recover from that mini cut, which shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't require much recovery. And then, basically solidifying at like the low 90s, eating as much as I can without actually gaining weight or body fat, and then starting my prep after that. So it's this kind of have to game plan it out if you're going to actually compete. If you're someone who is not going to ever compete, I think it makes a lot more sense instead of just perma-bulking and getting huge to just kind of maintain, which is kind of what you described earlier, Mo, where you're in a very small surplus, you're eating around maintenance, and you're letting a slow recomp take place. It might be a little less efficient than bulking for gaining muscle, but at the same time, you won't have to worry about dancing between bulks and cuts, which is something that actually came from the bodybuilding community. It's an artificial construct of our sport, right? Because we have to get shredded. That means we have to put body fat back on to be healthy enough to then gain muscle. And because we're then having to get unshredded and put on body fat, then we have to cut again. So there is forced cyclical dieting for bodybuilders that doesn't have to be there for non-competitive lifters. And I think in most cases, it's not necessary outside of kind of the initial beginner phase. Like your first year, unless you're starting overweight, which there's plenty of people who are, so that doesn't apply to you. You might actually be losing weight when you first start getting into bodybuilding. Like for me, I was a skinny kid growing up. So I put on like 10 kilos or so in my first year of training. And my body fat didn't change because I was gaining the same amount of, or more, enough muscle with the body fat I gained to keep the relative proportion the same. So I stayed around, 12% body fat or whatever. And then after that, then it's kind of like, all right, you can just move into recomping. Unless you're just really, really serious about bodybuilding, which I was. So I went through bulking phases and cutting phases, but I knew I was going to eventually compete. So I think it's just really important to make sure that the methods you're using are appropriate for the end goal. Don't just copy what competitive bodybuilders are doing, because we're forced into some of the decisions we make, and then we're making the best of that situation.
Yeah, this is a really important point that you mentioned, because I feel like even for the local bodybuilders, not only the international bodybuilders, they preach this on their social media. Like, all right, I'm going to go on a bulk phase. Then you see their face going like around like potatoes and they gain a lot of fat. And the casual gym goer is like, all right, I want to look not like this, but I want to be lean and look good like this bodybuilder. So they feel like this is the approach to this. Like, I have to bulk, then cut. It's a really important point that you mentioned right there.
Yeah, that's really amazing, because a lot of people think it's mandatory to do this, to do like bulking and cutting. If you are like only a recreational lifter and just want to do this for like lifestyle stuff, it's not really good to do, because it's really painful on your mind.
I think we're done with the like off-season part of it, of building muscles and how you can do that in a mandatory way. The question that always comes to mind when people are done with this bulking phase, let's say it was a good bulk, now I have to prep for the show and cut all the fat. How can people like manage their metabolism slowing down and reach a good body fat for the stage without losing as much muscles and not having as much fat? Because as you said, people are underestimating the body fat percentage they're having.
Yep, great question. Yeah, the biggest mistake with bulking is trying to do it too quick. The biggest mistake people make with cutting is also trying to do it too quick. We were talking about Ina Gerta's research on, hey, if you try to gain weight too quickly, most of it's body fat. The faster you try to lose weight, the greater proportion of it will be lean mass. And this has been shown even more convincingly with more data than the weight gain and body fat accrual with too quickly. So there's a number of things which impact the likelihood and the proportion of lean mass you're going to lose. Some of them are if you're not doing very effective training or not training at all. Like if you're someone who just kind of does your typical crash diet, jump on the elliptical, you do some cabbage soup diet, you're not a bodybuilder, you're just trying to get leaner, you're trying to drop body fat, you might lose 50-50 body fat muscle mass, or at least lean body mass, right? And you kind of see that in people who are just kind of casual dieters. They look unhealthy, but even though they get smaller. But simply weight training is by far the biggest thing you can do to prevent muscle loss. You can crash diet and lift weights and it'll be way better than not lifting weights. Kind of hard to get the training in, and I don't recommend it, but it's the biggest weapon of choice to maintain muscle mass. After that, though, it's the size of the deficit. And generally, I recommend people lose like 0.5 to 1% of their body weight per week. And that creates a situation where the size of the deficit, the likelihood of kind of slipping into that red S that I talked about earlier, and then the amount of muscle mass that they might lose is a lot less. And we see these slower rates of weight loss typically maintaining performance and lean body mass better than faster. And then the third thing is, how lean are you? Another really consistent finding we see in the data is that when you make lean people diet, it affects them differently than when you take people with obesity or people who are overweight and they diet. If you take men with obesity and they start dieting, typically their testosterone levels improve because they are getting a little healthier, right? And if you take, on average at least, not everyone who's with obesity is necessarily unhealthy. You take lean men and you start dieting them, the testosterone goes down, right? Same thing when you take men with obesity and they start dieting, doesn't really seem to affect their baseline muscle protein synthesis, which is kind of a surrogate measure for, are they in an anabolic state, if you will? Are they able to maintain their muscle mass? But when you take lean men and you do it, you start to see amino acid oxidation and muscle protein breakdown go up and muscle protein synthesis go down. So your body is using your body fat. And when you don't have it, it's got to use something else. And there's not much left on you except lean mass. So there's a lot of things you can do to reduce that impact. And a lot of it is kind of the opposite of what most bodybuilders do. So typically bodybuilders will diet harder and harder and harder and harder as they get to the show. Maybe they're not as serious in the beginning because it's 6 months away. I'm doing fine. And they're losing fat at a decent clip. But then they start to hit plateaus because it gets harder and your body fights you the leaner you get. And then they turn up the amount of cardio. They cut down the amount of calories they're doing. They get nervous, they feel the show approaching. They're not looking the way they want and they push it a little too fast. And that's when they typically lose muscle mass. They're enhancing the amount of stress they're getting from being lean with having an even higher deficit. And really they should be doing the opposite. So in that 0.5 to 1% range, I like to be more aggressive at the start of a diet. You've got more body fat on you. You don't have any weeks of dieting behind you. You're actually quite resilient. Like you skip a few meals when you're 15, 20% body fat, you barely notice it.
Yep.
You skip a few meals when you're 7% body fat, your blood glucose tanks, you feel like crap and you're irritable and you can't perform, right? So typically that 1% rate of weight loss is something reserved for like the first third of the diet. And then it should start to slow down. And, something that we often do with our clients is they'll have like multiple days at maintenance in the week towards the end of the diet. So they're only dieting 3 or 4 days, maybe 5 days at most out of the week. And we're kind of bringing them out of the deficit because they're so lean, and you can feel that acutely. We need to preserve the training, which we said is the best tool we have to maintain muscle mass. But if you can't train effectively because you're feeling so lethargic, it's a problem. So you might only need to lose like another 2 kilos, towards the last end of your diet. Like right now, I'm probably 2 kilos over stage weight, but I'm 8 weeks out, and I could have lost those 2 kilos in 4 weeks at the start of my diet and been fine. If I try to lose, 2 kilos in 4 weeks right now, when I've already got basically stage condition going, minus maybe just getting my glutes in, I'm going to feel like crap. My training's going to go in the toilet. I'll flatten out a lot. You'll see my glycogen deplete a whole lot, and I'll start to get a little bit smaller, and I'll probably sacrifice some muscle in the process of getting in shape. But if I pace myself and I take the full 8 weeks to lose 2 kilos, now I'm in a much better position. And I might even get ready early, and I can start bringing up my calories, get into maintenance, regain some lost tissue, regain some lost fullness, refill glycogen, and look like I'm actually gaining muscle into my show and look leaner. So that's a really important way of thinking of it. It's giving yourself enough time. I talked about that earlier. Most bodybuilders dieting 5+ months, and then making sure that you time it appropriately so that you're losing much more body fat. You're being more aggressive when your body's more resilient, and then you're being more conservative, and you're coming out of your diet with either refeeds or diet breaks or just dieting slower towards the end, so that you're not putting yourself in a precarious position when you're physiologically at a place where you're more likely to lose muscle mass and you want to maintain your training performance. So those are the biggest things. The other stuff is important, but it's relatively minor, like making sure you're eating enough protein, making sure you have enough carbohydrate to fuel training, having an appropriate macronutrient breakdown, not doing excess cardio. Those things get talked about a lot, but compared to not dieting too fast, not having too big of a deficit, and then not really crushing yourself when you're already lean, those are of minor importance.
So how much protein? People would say, okay, if you're on a deficit, you should take the upper limit, 2.2, 2.5. Does that add any benefits to preserving muscles?
Probably. We don't have great data on whether or not you preserve more muscle mass with higher protein intakes versus more moderate protein intakes during a deficit or when you're leaner, because it's hard to study long-term diets in lean people who are resistance trained. There's just not a lot of research on it, but there's theoretical reasons to think so, and anecdotal reasons that back that up, and limited data that points in that direction. My general rule of thumb is, hey, you want to eat like at least 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein in the off season. And then when you're dieting, you probably want to bump that up a little bit, just exactly like you said. If 1.6 to 2.2 is our range, maybe use the upper half, or feel free to go a little bit above that when you're dieting, especially as you get leaner. There is data on like, why do we lose muscle? What's the underlying mechanisms? The primary reason, and this is if you take anybody and you put them into a deficit, is that their muscle protein synthetic response to training is reduced. So you don't get quite as much muscle protein. Training is less effective when you're not eating enough calories. So MPS is somewhat blunted, and you can overcome that to some degree with protein and training. However, when you get leaner, not only is muscle protein synthesis blunted, but muscle protein breakdown increases when you're comparing lean people to not lean people, and they start going into a calorie deficit. So maybe you need a higher protein dose to offset that to some degree, at least makes sense. But we have a kind of a gap in the literature. We have a lot of comparisons of high protein diets to low protein diets. We have relatively few on moderate protein diets to high protein diets. So at this stage, there is no really good data to be confident about it, although you will hear a lot of bodybuilders and coaches say, I see better outcomes when I have higher protein. But it may not be for muscle retention reasons. There's also some data to indicate that higher protein intakes to a point can better preserve mood and satiety and blunt hunger to some degree. It's not a massive thing, not as much as like fruits and vegetables and having fiber in your diet, but it is one other little feather in your cap that can help that. So generally, most of the time when I'm dieting someone, I kind of set the low end is around like 2 grams per kilogram, and the high end around, say, 2.5, 2.6, somewhere in there. And then if personal preference dictates, a little bit higher or a little bit lower, or their prior data, if they can show me like, hey, this prep went really well and I did this, then I'm happy to customize it. So I think, generally protein intake, it is important, but it's not so critically important that there's going to be a massive difference between 1.9 and like 2.4. It's somewhere in that range is okay. And if you have a day at 1.6, like, you're not going to lose muscle that day, So
some of the stuff that you mentioned is when people that are obese actually, when they cut down weight, their testosterone level goes up. Like, I had some issues with one of my clients, which is I'm pretty sure that we are on a deficit, but his body weight does not go down, but his body composition like improves. Like, his waist is going down, all of his measurements are going down, which is something that I want people to know. Is being on a deficit, I think it's something that makes you lose body fat, but not necessarily make you lose body weight, because as you mentioned, being an obese will make you, when you go down on a deficit, you'll increase testosterone, which actually makes water retention goes up, I think, right?
Well, a lot more of this just has to do. Well, certainly that could be part of it. It could be shifts in body water. But typically, what's happening there is when you have a relatively novice lifter who's relatively high in body fat, they're building muscle, and the energy composition of muscle, what it takes to put on a certain weight of muscle, is different than what it takes to put on a certain weight of body fat. This is something people understand if they track their macros, right? So 1 gram, a unit of mass of fat, is 9 calories, right? But 1 gram of protein is only 4. And that's a gram of protein, not a gram of hydrated muscle tissue, right? So the actual energetic value of a pound of muscle, like if you were just to take it off somebody and like burn it at a bomb calorimeter, it's only like a fourth or a fifth of that of body fat. Adipose tissue is much denser. It's mostly body fat, like 80, 85, 90% of a pound of adipose tissue is actually like triglyceride, right? But a pound of muscle mass is a whole lot of water, proteins, and structural components, right? So the surplus required to put on a pound of muscle is technically only like 800, 700-ish calories, something like that. What it in reality requires is fueling muscle protein synthesis, fueling and offsetting the increase in energy expenditure from training, and also potentially overcoming any increases in NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So the experience in the real world is that you might have to be in a similar surplus to put on a pound of muscle as you would to lose a pound of fat as far as a deficit. But the actual energy composition is quite different. So if you were to lose a pound of body fat and gain a pound of muscle in the same time frame, which absolutely a novice can do, it happens all the time because they're gaining muscle so easily, and we see it in tons of studies on untrained individuals. That's normal. That's actually like a 2,500, 2,800 calorie deficit. But because of those tissues both weighing a pound but having different energy density, the scale weight won't change. So it's not unreasonable for, say, like your first 2 months of training, to be putting on like a pound every couple of weeks and losing a pound here and there of body fat, and you're in a deficit, and you think, oh, what the heck's going on? So that's why it's important, especially in people with high body fat levels, to get some measurements and talk about how do your clothes fit. If your waist measurement's going down in a man, if your hip measurement's going down in a woman from being in a deficit, if they're feeling their clothes fit better, if they're getting stronger, if their face and their shape is getting better, not this lean, not like this, we don't want that, but like if it's getting a little more oval and a little less round, but body weight staying the same, then kind of just stop focusing on body weight for a little bit. Eventually, though, that will stop. Unfortunately, it'd be nice if we could just recomp our way to 10% body fat, right? But typically what happens is once someone has been lifting weights progressively for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, they just can't gain muscle that quickly anymore. So that, when they're in a deficit, it's harder to build muscle. Now they're going to start losing body weight as their muscle mass is like barely going up, or maybe even plateauing while they lose body fat. So that's very common. Another really common thing is that you'll take someone who is high in body fat, and not always, but oftentimes they might have a diet that is not very high in fiber, not very high in fruit and vegetables. It's high in processed foods. And if you take, a pound of highly processed foods devoid of fruits and vegetables, it's going to have a very high energy content. But if they start eating a diet that is composed of different foods, like they're eating fruit and a vegetable and a lean meat at each meal, or a low-fat dairy option or something like that, that will still weigh a pound, maybe even more they might actually be increasing the weight of the food they're eating. If you eat a pound of apples, that's a whole lot less calories than like a pound of pancakes. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So that's obviously an extreme example. But a lot of the times people will go on a diet and the weight of their food, despite the calories going down by 500 or 1,000, stays the same or actually goes up. So now their digestive tract is actually holding a higher weight. So they might see that, the first week they lose a bit from water loss, sodium changes, all that. And once they kind of balance out, they might be gaining some muscle, losing some body fat, but then also having their gut weight tick up as they've got all this food in there.
Wow,
So
man.
the scale weight
I have to listen to this
is
again.
not a perfect metric. And I think people need to understand that. And that's something actually powerlifters understand. Like if you've ever done a gut cut, right? How do we lose, how do I get from 95 to 93 without doing any dehydration? I just eat chocolate and whey protein drinks for 3 days and I will drop 2 kilos because I'm normally eating like 3 pieces of fruit per day, probably a couple plates of vegetables and a bunch of lean meat. And now I'm just taking in, 30 grams of protein to get, 25 grams of protein each time I eat, no fruits, no vegetables. And I'm eating like a dark chocolate bar, which the whole thing only weighs like, 100 grams versus the same calories in 700 grams. So you can lose weight without actually changing your body composition at all. It's important to understand that. So all of those things are confounding variables. And I think that's why you need to wait multiple weeks before you're assessing scale weight change and really knowing what it means and why it's useful, especially in people who are higher in body fat for circumference measurements, the way clothes fit, and even just the way you look to be additional data points.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Like,
I would have to say the way Omar Isuf said it. Oof, Eric. I couldn't. He has this thing. I don't know how to mimic him, but this is one of the Eric moments.
that's amazing. That's amazing. Like, I think one of the fears of people going on a cut is always like having the fear of damaging their metabolism, which is something a lot of people are afraid of, and having like this fear of going on a diminishing return of like, okay, I'm not losing body weight or body fat, I'll just go on a lower calories and I'll damage my metabolism. I'll just go in a limited fight with my metabolism. Is that something that people should be afraid of? Is it their metabolism, or is it like their NEAT going down? Like a lot of people have this fight.
It can be both, but I think the framing of it is very important. Understanding that it is temporary and that it starts to resolve itself as soon as you're done with the deficit is very important. And also that for the most part, you can at least work around it. There are limits to how much your energy expenditure can go down. Our body is great at adapting, but it doesn't break the laws of thermodynamics. It doesn't break the laws of physics, right? It's not like you starve someone and they go like, well, good thing I got metabolic damage, I'm gonna be fine. They will suffer from being starved, right? So actually, this is really interesting. I just got back 2 days ago from being in Texas, and I went to Texas Tech, where Dr. Grant Tinsley has arguably the best body composition testing facility in North America. And in addition to 9 different types of body composition assessments, I also got my resting metabolic rate tested. So resting metabolic rate, very similar to basal metabolic rate, except it doesn't require you to be like in a slept state and like really controlling your movement and putting you in much tighter conditions, but it's pretty tight. You have to lay there, relaxed, not moving, not talking for 5 minutes, and then they put a ventilated hood on you so they can measure carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange and figure out what your actual resting metabolic rate is, or just how many calories you burn just to maintain your physiology at rest. And mine, just from last week, was a little over 1,700 calories, right? Now, that sounds normal-ish. It's definitely in the range of what you might expect. But when you actually take into account that I'm a 6-foot active male who is, around 80 kilos, all of the prediction equations were higher than my actual. We compared it against like 10. The prediction equations range from like 1,750 all the way up to like 2,150. And I'm down here in the low 1,700. So depending upon the equation that you think is right, I'm somewhere between a negligible amount of calories to like 400 calories lower than I should be. The most accurate one, he's actually looked at off-season bodybuilders on average, would probably put me around 2,000, something like that, 2,100. So yeah, I'm like 20% lower than my predicted RMR. I'm not 100% lower. I'm not 60% lower. And I'm probably not going to get any lower than that. But that is a reduction in RMR. And RMR is only it's a large portion, but it's not the entire component of my energy expenditure. Typically, the way you would estimate energy expenditure in a setting like this is you would test RMR, and then you would multiply it by an activity factor. So, for example, being sedentary is like 1.2. So let's say if I was sedentary, which we know I'm not, I train, I do cardio, I go on walks and whatnot, I would be around 2,100, 2,000 calories just to maintain weight if I just sat around all day while being, shredded, which those two things don't go hand in hand. So that's probably not it. And then if I was lightly active, that would go up to like a 1.375 modifier. If I was very active, it'd be 1.5. And the mistake most lifters think is, hey, I lift 4, 5, 6 days a week. I've got to be like heavily active. But lifting weights for an hour 4 times a week is not quite that. And if you're sedentary outside of it, you might actually be somewhere around moderately active or lightly active. And just like you intimated, NEAT actually goes down more than RMR. It's the most adaptable component of total daily energy expenditure, which consists of the thermic effect of feeding, which is just what it takes to convert food into energy. There is your basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate. There's your exercise activity expenditure, and there's your non-energy, non-exercise activity thermogenesis or expenditure, so your NEAT. Now, there's an obligatory reduction in calories from the thermic effect of food. It takes about 10% of the calories you eat on average to turn them into food. So if you're eating, say, 3,000 calories, what's your NEAT? 300, right? But if you cut down to 2,000 calories, now all of a sudden your NEAT's 200, right? 10% of 2,000. So there's an immediate reduction in your energy expenditure just from dieting with no metabolic adaptation of 100 calories in that example. Can't change it, can't do anything about it. However, there's other sources as well. So yes, if you diet down to a bodybuilding stage condition like me, you might see your RMR go down, but it'll probably be to a much smaller degree if you're not getting as lean as I am. And that's individual. Some people see larger or smaller reductions. So you might have a large reduction like me. That's just kind of the hand I was dealt in life, but maybe not. What you will see much larger reductions in is NEAT. So NEAT, depending on the person, they can be either 2 different phenotypes or neither. They might just be kind of in the middle. That's spendthrift or thrifty. So basically, are you someone who, when you start to diet and you increase your activity levels, do you see large changes in NEAT or small changes in NEAT? Based upon my own prior history, I know that I'm actually pretty thrifty. You start dieting me, I start doing a lot of cardio, you'll see my NEAT come down. So one of the ways I can offset that is just maintaining my step count. Because if I don't pay attention to my step count, I'll notice that it'll just habitually come down and I lean on things more. I don't have this good posture. A lot of subconscious things go in to just try to reduce my energy expenditure.
So if
we also have data. Go ahead.
Sorry, before we get to that, if I want to conclude it to the people who are listening, you are saying that people overestimate. They put so much on that I'm not losing body fat because my metabolism is going down, and they underestimate how much their NEAT is. How to say it? Like
how much is NEAT like playing
a big role?
Play a role in it.
Is that right?
Because I have some people do it. It's just like they start doing more cardio, so they're doing like 300 to 500 calories per week, and like go up to 1,000 calories per week, and they say, okay, I went up in activity, but my body weight does not go down. I went up more deficit, but my body weight went down. I was like, can you go and open your health account and let's see your weekly average steps? It's just like from 10,000 calories, just plummeted down to 5,000, which is something just compensate you. You raised it up from here and you went down from here. It was just, you're not doing anything.
100%.
Yeah.
And actually, it may be worse to try to get a whole lot more activity in situations like this. We're getting more and more data out of this. I think people should definitely check out some of the work by Dr. Erik Trexler, who is now very interestingly taken a new role at Duke, where he's working with Herman Poncer, who wrote the book Burn that everyone's very interested in. It's quite popular. But I think his academic work is a little more interesting, where he proposes the constrained energy model, or rather versus the additive energy expenditure model, which is simply saying that as you increase activity through exercise or just general activity that's not exercise, other components of energy expenditure decrease to some degree to keep you a little more constrained. It's not a perfect compensation. It's not going to completely negate things, but depending upon the person, whether they're spendthrift or thrifty, you can see a small compensation or a very large one. But it's very difficult to compensate a deficit that you're creating from calories. Doesn't mean you should go too large of a deficit, but you should be aware that as you increase your energy expenditure from exercise, you probably will see some reduction in NEAT. So some of the ways you can combat that are just maintaining a consistent step count while you diet, so that when you add other things or you take calories away, that you'll be dealing with a much more similar baseline. Step count doesn't capture everything, but one thing we started doing in, say, 2016, 2017 at 3DMJ was we would actually start having our clients track step count, not to necessarily increase it, although we do that sometimes, but just to keep it the same throughout prep, so that we're much more confident that when we cut macros or cut calories, or we increase step count, that it's happening in a situation where something else isn't going down, like you both said. And it's been noticeably better in terms of predictability. It was exactly what you'd said before. We could throw a bunch of cardio at somebody and we'd see a very disproportionate drop in body weight, or maybe nothing sometimes. But now, if they're doing 7,000 steps per day, and we give them one cardio session on after 2 of their workouts, and we also cut carbs by 25 grams, and we have a very predictable drop in scale weight, and they start to get leaner. So I think 100% people are not aware that this is not an independent equation. When you start to mess with energy expenditure, or when you start to mess with energy intake, it affects the other. And it can affect it a lot more in certain people.
That's amazing. I think having a timeline will be an amazing for the start of your cutting phase or on season to the peak week. Like, a lot of people talk about peak week. So let's say I have to start my cutting phase to a show. What is the goal of body fat should I be, like an estimation to start of my cutting phase? So say, okay, I'll have a bodybuilding show in like 8 months. So I should be at that body fat percentage 6 months from that show. And to the peak week, I should be like around like how much body fat? Is there like some specification to that?
I think it's easier to speak in terms of your percentage over stage weight and how many pounds or kilos you are off, because ultimately body fat's going to get misestimated. And it's very difficult to know if you're losing lean body mass in the process. And not all lean body mass losses, I would say probably the majority of lean body mass losses, are necessarily skeletal muscle mass. As you decrease calories, I wouldn't be surprised if you're decreasing liver mass a little bit, and also decreasing the amount of smooth muscle that you have in your GI tract. In fact, there's some data to indicate that a lot of changes to metabolism, so quote unquote metabolic adaptation or metabolic damage, could be attributed to losses of organ mass, reversible, normal, not unhealthy losses in organ mass. And they're the most metabolically active tissue. So even though you only lose a small amount of, say, some of your organ mass, it's going to have a disproportionate decrease in energy expenditure. So anyway, point is that I could say something like, hey, you want to start at 18% body fat as a male 8 months out in your example, and you're going to finish at 5 or 6%. And you want to do that a few weeks in advance so you can bring calories up. But you're not going to be able to actually measure your body fat percentage. A better way to think of it is you probably want to start your contest prep diet 10 to 15% over stage weight. And probably no higher than that, probably no less than that, unless you're really someone who just thrives on being lean and you just have a naturally low body fat and you just need to get a little bit leaner to compete, but that's pretty rare. Most people are going to want to start in that 10 to 15% over stage weight range. And if you're closer to 10% over stage weight, so in my example, let's say I competed 80 kilos, that's closer to 88, closer to 15% would be closer to like 92, 93, right? So if I start at 92, 93, I'm going to need more time. And that's probably going to be more like a 7 to 8 month diet, like you said. And if I'm starting around 88, now we're looking at more like a 5-month diet. And the goal should be to get down to being only a couple percentage points over stage weight when you're about 1 month out, maybe as early as 2 months out. Because at that point, you can actually start to decrease the size of the deficit and actually increase calories, closing that deficit and actually seeing yourself get leaner while regaining lost tissue, regaining lost glycogen, and doing what we call eating into the show. As an example, in 2019, my last season, I did my last digging phase to get into stage shape in May. And that was actually 2 months before, 1 month and 2 months before my shows in July and August. And then for the entire month of June through July and then into early August, I was increasing my calories. And I was looking better. Now, my actual leanness level probably improved a little bit, but what improved a lot was my overall glycogen levels. I regained lost muscle mass, or at least the appearance of it, as I went down. So my body weight stayed roughly the same, right around like 79 to 80, but I looked better over time. And that's a really good position to be in, because peak week traditionally in bodybuilding, and for those who don't know what peak week is, it's the manipulation, traditionally, not necessarily what I'm recommending, but traditionally, people are loading carbohydrates, manipulating their electrolytes, and reducing their water to try to get this combined look of low subcutaneous water, high intramuscular water from retention from glycogen, stored carbohydrate, and this perfect saran wrap look on game day that's transient, only lasts a little bit, and then it'll dissipate. The reality is it's very difficult to do that, and muscle is like 70-75% water, so when you cut water, you typically look smaller. And if you try to load a whole bunch of carbohydrates while restricting sodium, restricting water, it can actually inhibit, glycogen loading because it causes GI distress. The carbohydrate transporters in the gut are actually sodium ion dependent. So you can just get a bunch of stomach cramping, not get anywhere. And also glycogen is not just bound with the 3 grams of water that we traditionally see in textbooks on physiology. That's kind of the minimum. But in a hydrated state, it can be as high as like 17 grams of water. So the reason why a lot of enhanced bodybuilders cut water is because they're getting more water retention because they're taking a bunch of hormones, right? But if you're not doing that, then you probably don't need to manipulate water a lot. And I have literally never cut water in any of the hundreds of competitors that I've coached into states. I might control it a little bit, but I've never actually had them purposely dehydrate. So the process of peak week should be much less extreme than you'll traditionally see, especially in the enhanced ranks. It's some combination of carbohydrate increases, and that process is much more predictable when you've been steadily bringing up your carbohydrates for a month or two. In fact, you may not even really need to run a peak week if you do that.
That's a hot take.
Be like a slight bump up on Friday. When I did this in 2019, by the time I was 2 weeks out from my show in July, from having finished this process in May and increasing my calories each week for all of June and the first week of July, every day looked like I was peaked. It's like, hey, put me in, coach. I'm ready. I was sending pictures regularly to Berto because I was walking around on about 200 grams of carbs more. Well, that's not true. 150 grams of carbs more than I was when I was in that digging phase. So why would I be flat? Why would I be retaining water? I'm not beat up. I'm not inflamed. I'm not having as much dieting stress. The whole process got easier. So peak week just became have an extra 50 grams on Friday, instead of this complex manipulation that is a lot of the times a higher risk of messing up the way you look than it is helping it. So not everyone has the luxury of doing that or the experience of knowing how to get lean before the show is even there. But ideally, you're getting pretty lean beforehand, and then you're bringing your calories up. You're kind of doing like a linear load over multiple weeks. If you are still kind of like, oh, I'm behind, I need to get lean, for this I'm 2 weeks out, I just need to drop like maybe a little bit more, then you can do something like a backload where you're dieting all the way up till say Wednesday or Thursday. And then on Friday, you're doing a relatively aggressive, carb load. And then on Saturday morning, you're kind of taking it easy and just maintaining that look. And that definitely can work. But you're betting a lot on a single day. And you kind of are forcing yourself into a position where you want to be conservative, because if you overshoot and you're taking in far more carbohydrate than you can even store, you're going to get GI distress, water retention, and you'll look worse, and it won't be worth it. And it's better to be, 95% full than it is to be 101% because you spill over a little bit and it starts to blur your definition. So that's kind of the ideal way to do it. And typically that's why you see when someone does multiple shows in a season, unless they're doing something extreme or crazy with, water and electrolyte manipulation, it typically look better as the shows go on to a point. If they try to go too long, then, the fatigue catches up with them. But they'll look better. Let's say they're doing a show in like, June, July, August, and they've been dieting since February. A lot of the times they'll look better in those later shows because they're not as flat. They have had more time to correct from the months of dieting beforehand. Those multiple shows and peak weeks are kind of add on top of each other. They're already lean and they don't need to be in a deficit between shows unless they're, like binging after the show and having to bring back down, which, save the huge meal post show for after your last show of the season.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
That's crazy.
This is a really hot take on Peak Week. It needs another episode because, but the question that comes to my mind, does that also apply to enhanced bodybuilders? Or can they benefit from that? That's like the question I have in mind right now.
It's tough to answer that question because you're asking the wrong guy. I've never actually peaked an enhanced competitor. I have a lot of friends and colleagues and I know people who do it. And the thing is like there's a lot more similarities between various natural competitors. But you can have an enhanced guy who's running a little bit of testosterone, and you can have an enhanced guy who's running DNP, growth hormone, insulin, a lot of testosterone and synthetic testosterone on top of that. And there's going to be a way different environment there, a whole bunch of, water retention going on, huge fluctuations in scale weight. The other guy is just like, maybe I need to go on something to control water retention, and that's it. And the other person is like, am I leaner? Am I fatter? What's going on? And it's 20 pound scale weight changes, day to day. So that's just not something I have expertise in. So there's huge gradations of enhanced.
A lot of variables.
Like half natty to Ronnie Coleman, at his heyday. And then for natural, it's like
it's consistent.
Yeah. That's crazy. I actually like noticed that with like being a power lifter, like when I cut down weight and I'll actually look fuller like 2 weeks after the powerlifting competition. I look leaner and fuller with actually like more body weight, which is crazy. So after the peak week, you already done your show. A lot of people say, okay, don't binge eat. Don't eat a lot of food because you'll actually gain a lot of fat faster because your metabolism is slowing down and you have like these adipose tissue that are really hungry for this fat. So how to do it like after the show? Is it like it doesn't matter, do whatever you want, or is there a way to go up after the show?
Good question. Yeah, it's one of the hardest things too, because you can take a look at what you might think is best on paper, but the reality is you're starving. And every single signal in your body is going to tell you to eat a lot. So the good news is that, okay, what's the goal of the off season? It's to put on muscle. Is the environment of being shredded good for putting on muscle? Testosterone's in the toilet, can't sleep, glycogen's low, training's poor, you're more injury prone, all the symptoms of red S. No. So it's not an issue that your body is primed to put on body fat. And it is. You're 100% right. Your energy expenditure is lower than predicted. And those fat cells are just waiting to start storing triglyceride. We have data on what happens to bodybuilders when they binge eat post-show. And they gain almost entirely body. Like they don't put on any lean body mass. Actually, Dr. Trexler was part of some of this research. They see no change in lean body mass. They see increases in body water and adipose tissue from eating a lot of food post-show. But is that a problem? Only if you really overdo this for a while, because part of the reason why you feel like crap is because you're so much lower than a healthy body fat for you, right? So it's way better for muscle building to be at, say, 10% body fat than 5% body fat. So the goal really needs to be shifted towards recovery, not trying to maintain his leanness while slowly putting on weight, not just focused totally on the eating experience, but focused on mental and physical recovery. And this actually seems to really enhance adherence and accelerates the point at which you're actually able to put on muscle mass after the contest season is over. So what we describe for the recovery diet is basically a purposeful increase in calories with the goal of gaining body fat to a reasonable rate. And this kind of gives permission to the athlete of saying, hey, the goal is actually to put on some body fat. We shouldn't be afraid of body fat. It's an organ tissue. It's not just this inert stuff on you. And when your body fat is too low, it harms performance. It harms your ability to perform. It harms your ability to put on muscle. You don't want to be in this state. So typically the goal is to gain, say, maybe 4 to 8% over stage weight. And that's like a legitimate, like not bloated weigh-in, but what you weigh like after kind of like one of those big eating sessions settles, like 2 days later on a scale, within 1 to 2 months, So maybe getting as high as 10% over stage weight in 2 months, or maybe 1 month, somewhere in that range. It's a big range because it really depends on the individual, their experience level, and how they felt at the end of prep. And this basically fast tracks you to the lower end of your kind of intervention point, or like the range that your body likes to be at in terms of body fat. It gets you to kind of like a sustainable, but still low body fat percentage within a couple months. And that does a huge favor to you in terms of blunting hunger, providing satiety. And when you're given something that's much more easy to sustain, like the typical like hardcore reverse diet, you might have been dieting on 1,800 calories, and okay, you go to 2,100 or like 2,000, and you cut your cardio in half. Like you're still dieting, and it's almost impossible to adhere to that. And then it sets you up for failure, because when you struggle to reverse diet, and then boom, you go out and you have this big binge fest and you eat 5,000 calories at a restaurant, what do? I got to get back on the reverse diet. You might even overcorrect, go back into a deficit. It makes no sense. And it also makes the athlete feel like they don't have self-efficacy, feel like they're failing. But if you have an athlete who's just dieting on 1,800 calories, and you tell them, hey, I want you to start eating 3,000 calories and cut your cardio in half, they're like, whoa, okay, coach, sweet. And they're be much less likely to binge. And when they do binge, it won't be, I went from 1,800 to 7,000. It's like I went from 3,000 to 4,000. That's much less of a big deal, especially when they know the goal is actually to put on some body fat. So it's the interesting thing, if you look at research on binge eating, the biggest predictor for what causes binge eating is restriction. So people get into these restrict and binge cycles. So after a show is over, and before this even comes, as a coach, it's really important to have this conversation with your athlete. Like, look, we've been laser focused on losing body fat for 6 months. That's going to change. We're going to start focusing on performance in the gym in a few weeks. We're going to start focusing on, hitting PRs, because you've been struggling to even maintain your strength. We're going to cover up a little more when we go into the gym, and we're going to focus on a diet that promotes recovery. And that's going to include putting on body fat at a reasonable rate. Also, you've been tracking macros, you've been tracking calories, you've been controlling your intake.
Yep.
We're not just going to take that away completely. We're going to ease off. So let's say you were tracking macros. Now we're going to check the scale weight 3 days a week instead of 7 days a week. And we're just going to go protein and calories, and we're going to give you a broader range. Instead of needing to be within 50 calories or 100 calories your target, plus or minus 200, right? And I'm going to give you a big bump. So here's another 1,200 calories to play with. You can be off by 100 or 200 either direction. Just hit your protein. Don't worry about the macro spread. So you can maybe go out to eat. You can be a little more flexible. So I'm still keeping structure there, but it's a massive reduction in mental stress and a large increase in calories. And then once they put that body weight back on in those first 1 to 2 months, then you can go to kind of like that gain-taining process.
Amazing.
And that is much more likely to set the athlete up for success
Amazing.
than trying to stay really, really lean rigidly, or just going like, hey, good luck. Pizza's fun. Talk to you next year, which can result in them actually spending most of their off-season dieting because they put on body weight too quickly.
I think the biggest factor that people get from restriction is the mental factor. So as you mentioned, Erik, just now, like the feeling of being restricted is the main thing that makes people feel like they want to binge. For this episode, we've been hyping it up. Like, all right, we got Erik Helms on the show and stuff. So we wanted people to be included. We wanted our community from On the Bench to be included. So we had a lot of questions for you. Some of it is personal. Some of it is not. So I hope you're ready for that. So we're going to have these questions and give us like answers in like 3 to 5 sentences. Like just short and sweet. For the questions.
Speed round. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question is coming from like Snapchat.
Oh, we don't have the name.
You don't have the name for him. We're sorry. He quoted like Mike Minter. He said, Mike Minter says negatives like eccentric are more important than the concentric or the positive in like mechanical growth. Is that true? Is that statement correct or not?
Possibly. We don't have great data on this because it's hard to compare the eccentric to the concentric because you're actually stronger eccentrically. Like you don't see people who miss a squat on the way down, right? They come out of the hole, they get stuck. So you can lower a heavier weight than you can lift. But when you're actually in the gym using regular gym equipment, you're limited by your concentric strength. So that advantage may not actually be there. But the eccentric is probably at least as important as the concentric. So when you're training, you need to make sure that you're not just letting gravity do it for you. You actually do want to make sure that you're controlling the eccentric, and then you can lift explosively on the concentric. But ultimately, you got to perform both. So yeah, don't skirt on the eccentric. But also, Mike Menser, great physique, kind of crazy. Just if you know your history, like he was actually like a methamphetamine addict and took things a little far.
Okay, damn.
And
I didn't see that one coming, man.
Love him. I'm not trying to trash people's profit, but he said some crazy stuff. Like he had a classic quote, which makes no sense. It only takes one bullet to kill a man, so why would it take more than one set to grow muscle?
What?
If you think about that for more than 3 seconds, it makes no sense. Like that is not an analogy.
I think he mentioned that as well.
He
That's his second question.
like his second question is like having one set per muscle per day is enough to grow the muscle. Just...
Yeah.
The comparison is crazy. Like,
yeah, it's enough to grow muscle, but I mean, 3 sets is consistently like grows more. So, yeah.
Okay, and three bullets will actually kill a bear. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like 50 Cent got shot 5 times? He's still alive. So I mean,
you'll never know how many sets you need then.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay.
That's right.
So this question actually gets asked a lot. It's about the ashwagandha. Like a lot of people are asking about ashwagandha. Is it like an effective supplement? Is it necessary to have it or not? Like, is there like specific type of ashwagandha that I should take? Is there some...
And does it cause depression as well?
Yeah. Is there side effects of it?
Yeah, from the data I've seen, it has potentially small benefits for a lot of health metrics. It's an adaptogen, so the idea is that it makes you more resilient to stress. I don't know enough. I don't really pay that much attention to supplements because they are the least. So are they necessary? Absolutely not. No supplements necessary, and they do almost next to nothing. Some of them do enough next to nothing to maybe be worth it, like creatine. Ashwagandha, in my opinion, has become kind of overrated as of late. It's not that it doesn't work; it's just that it's still just a supplement. You know, like if you send in just your supplemental tax form, but not your actual taxes, the IRS is still going to come for you in the U.S. So you just have to think about this. Like your nutrition and your training is going to do way more for you than any kind of supplement, even one that does have evidence behind it. I would encourage everyone to check out examine.com. This is a third-party independent company that has a huge database of all of the human research on supplements, and they have great summaries. I don't know if you can immediately translate into Arabic, so that may not be super helpful, but it is a great resource for anyone who does speak English. Yeah, ashwagandha, probably a little overrated, definitely helps, more of a health supplement, and I don't know the dosing off the top of my head or the sourcing.
Okay, thanks.
I think we should do a collaboration for translation mass articles to Arabic.
Why not?
Hey, that's a full-time job because you're going to have to do it like every month, and you're going to have to get all the way back to 2017.
Yeah.
Think carefully before you.
So we move to the next question then.
Okay, we move to the next question. So this guy called Muslim98, he's asking like a personal question. Erik, you've been lean for so long. Why don't you bulk again? I think
because I got to compete. So, and I've been lean that long. I only started dieting in February. So,
I mean, you usually look lean in shows and interviews and in interviews and podcasts. So people assume that.
I think people just forget that social media, like you can, like, you know, that the profile picture on Instagram, That wasn't from yesterday. This is from 2019. So yeah.
Okay. This is a great question. Like, what did you give the sport, and what did it take from you? Like, I mean, what did the sport give you, and what did it take from you?
It gave me a sense of discipline, meaning, and self-efficacy. It was through bodybuilding that I realized I was a lot more resilient, capable, and could accomplish a lot more than what I thought my limitations were. Previously, I would probably not try very hard because I was afraid of the idea of trying hard and still failing, because it would confirm my insecurities that I actually wasn't smart enough, good enough, or whatever, that I didn't actually have self-worth. So by committing to bodybuilding and just telling myself, you know what, just put everything you have in and see where you go. Even though I didn't become like Mr. Olympia or anything like that, I was able to do things that I previously would have doubted myself. And that kind of just kept elevating and building on itself until I was not even recognizing the person in the mirror who I used to think was kind of a lazy guy. What did it take from me? Probably, at least initially, a normal relationship, normal, quote unquote, with like food and exercise and things like that. Some of that's good, because I don't think most people have a great relationship in a modern society anyway. Some of it was too much, and I had to learn how to then pull back. You know, I built this self-efficacy, I built this resilience, I became this kind of perennial, constant athlete, but I needed to find balance. Initially, it negatively impacted my relationships, not only with myself, but also with people around me who I love. So I had to recalibrate, and that ironically taught me and gave me something of how to be more of an adult.
Nice. Like, this username is too much too. A1367Z1. Okay. He's saying, how long does it take for a normal person to discover his athletic genes, or is he good in this sport or not?
You'll know pretty quick. If for one, I think even if you don't have great genetics for bodybuilding, giving it a good, you're going to get better than you were. And even if your genetics don't compare well to somebody else, it's a bad reason to lift weights to see, can I be bigger than other people or stronger than other people? It really should be compared to where you started. To answer the question directly and not be obtuse, if you're not putting on 15, 20 pounds of relatively lean muscle, like you're not seeing yourself get a lot higher body fat in the first year, you're probably relatively average, and that's okay. Most people are average. But most importantly is all the stuff that I answered in that prior question that you can get out of putting all that effort into bodybuilding. That can be applied to business, that can be applied to life. True. Finding the balance to be with it can improve your relationships. And you don't even need to compete, but the weight room, the act of your reward for lifting heavier, what is it? To lift even heavier. So it's always hard. That's a metaphor for life to some degree. You don't improve so you can rest on your laurels. You improve so you can seek new challenges.
Wow.
So you can become a continually better person.
Wow. Like, some guy actually told me a sentence which is really amazing. You're genetically gifted in something. If you are not genetically gifted in bodybuilding, you're genetically gifted in something else. Something else. You'll be better than everyone in something else. But in my opinion, I think being a genetically gifted in some sport will not make you a champion in it. If you don't have the passion for the sport, if you don't love the sport, you're not gonna be amazing at it.
The work ethic as well.
I see people say, in terms of like my limbs length, in terms of my muscle mass, which sport that I'm gonna be good at? If I'm gonna say swimming, you're not gonna be the best swimmer if you go there, if you don't have the passion for it. I think having that mentality gives like not the best sense, because like me as
You're basically asking,
yeah,
what can I do that's easy?
yes,
And that's not really how you build character, right? I mean, if you jump into it, you love it, and you take it to the highest height, then you also have good genetics. That's what world champions are. People with good genetics who also love it, have the passion, and push into it. But I tell you what, take something you're not good at, but you're good at it just enough so that you can improve and not be frustrated. You're never going to be much more than like a regional bench press third medalist or whatever. But the process of pushing yourself to be the best you can be in something that you're not gifted for, that'll teach you a ton of life lessons.
That's crazy.
That's stoic.
That's a good take.
That's a really stoic,
Mindset.
great take. Yeah.
Okay. So this guy actually, I think he's a big fan of you. So Faisal al-Shamri, who have like an equipment company. So he's asking hypertrophy for powerlifters. Just use the big three and variations of the big three for more reps, or do it like a bodybuilder?
Oh, good question.
That is a good question, and big thanks to him for following my content. I appreciate that. I think you probably can you can get it all from the power lifts. The question is what does that take out of you? It's hard to do a full effective hypertrophy session using like squats and deadlifts as your primary methods to grow your legs. There's a reason why bodybuilders do some squats and leg and deadlifts, but they're also doing leg press, leg extension, leg curl, lunges, step ups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's because you can get a lot more volume with less fatigue. Having been competing in both sports since the very beginning, just here's an example. I had an SBD day, not too long ago. It took me 2.5 hours, to do a top single and a couple back off sets on all three. That's 3 exercises. Yesterday, I went to a commercial gym. I did 11 exercises in 90 minutes, and so the pure efficiency you can get from having things like machines and cables, being able to do like a multi-hip and a weighted back extension and like a leg curl and a leg extension, instead of going like, right, so I'm going to do like 6x8 on squats and deadlifts. I think it makes it very worth it. And typically the approach I take is that I do less singles and some, low rep back off sets when I'm further from competition with my athletes who are powerlifters, and a lot more bodybuilding accessories. And then that proportion shifts as they get closer to competition. And that's kind of what you have to do, because you're trying to build the specific skill in the power lifts and just maintain that size. But yeah, when you don't have a competition on the horizon, do yourself a favor and include more bodybuilding and do less volume on the main lifts, so that you can build that muscle in a less stressful way. Especially, like, there's not many people who can handle high volumes of squats and deadlifts without getting hip and lower back issues that kind of start to create the bottleneck. And if you don't have it now, you probably will when you're older.
We have 2 more questions which are really necessary. Also from Faisal al-Shamri, macro splits to prioritize minimizing hunger. I'm okay with little muscle loss if I can adhere longer.
Yeah, it has much less to do with macros than it actually does food choices, actually. So you could take 2 people on the same macro split, and one person is eating much higher fiber and a higher amount of fruits and vegetables, and the other person is not. And most of their carbohydrate sources are low in fiber. Maybe they taste really good, and you're going to see a big difference in hunger. So the best thing you can do for yourself is make a good chunk of your energy intake consist of fruits and vegetables. So I would say for every, say, 500 calories in your diet, have 1 serving of fruit and 1 serving of vegetables each as a minimum, and I think that'll make things a lot better. And then just making sure that your protein is in the ranges we previously discussed. You do those 2 things, and you're going to see a much better hunger and satiety management.
That's amazing. Okay. Last question from Abdurrahman Lifts. While prepping for a bodybuilding show, how do you maintain your strength?
Don't die. So all the things we talked about before, very important. Not dieting too fast, dieting slower as you get leaner, appropriate protein intake, effective training. And then one of the things I like to do is I include singles on the main lifts. They don't take as long. So for me to work up to a single at like a 7 RPE on squat, that might only be 20 minutes. And that might be all I do, right? because after I finish my bodybuilding season, I'm going to probably get into some powerlifting, and it's just too hard and too demanding and too time inefficient. Like I was talking about before, to do like a 5x5 or something like that, and just train like a powerlifter while dieting. So instead, I do like the minimum dose of the main lifts to try to maintain strength. So I'll work up to a single 1 to 2 times a week on squats, once a week on deadlifts, and then 2 to 3 times a week on bench, and then do volume after that on other movements, machines, cables, dumbbells, etc. And that's a very effective way to maintain as much strength as you can, but also don't expect to maintain all your strength, right? There's a reason why we have weight classes in the sport. If you diet all the way down from 93 to 83, like I have, I expected to have some strength loss, and not all that necessarily is muscle loss. Like my bench went from 145 at the start of this prep to like 132, 135. Basically, every kilo of weight I lost was a kilo off my bench, and it's not because I lost a whole bunch of pecs and triceps. It's because my ass got smaller. My butt, which created more of a decline, which allowed me to arch more. When I do a leg drive now, I actually, I get my butt off the bench and I'm getting 2 reds.
Yeah, I mean, you have to go a bit lower on the bench as well. So
exactly. So I have to, like, my back, but my back fat is gone, so I feel less stable on the bench. I don't have as much to push against. There's actually chest fat that's gone, so the bar is going lower, and also I'm at less of a decline. And I had to change my shoes from my squat shoes, which I normally bench, into my deadlift shoes, just so when I do leg drive, I don't get that millimeter of light that can get it. So my range of motion is increased as I dieted. So some of it might be a little bit of muscle loss, but a lot of it is just the massive shift in position and changing. My deadlift also started to get worse, and I realized, hold on, I just need to tighten my belt up a notch, and then all of a sudden it was right where it was. So expect some strength loss, but it should be, if you're doing it right, you should see your good lift points or your dots, whatever you're paying attention to, should be going up. And if it's not going up as you're losing weight, then you need to take a look at your training or nutrition, or just consider that maybe you're trying to get too lean.
Did you think about it this way before?
Yes, I do.
To be honest.
Yeah, because I actually don't store a lot of fat in my back. That's why when I like diet down, I don't lose strength on my bench press. So I know
Nice.
that was my analogy.
Because Mo has said before in the podcast, like he stores fat in different areas, so he doesn't have to worry about the things you said in the bench press.
So,
I'm just coping over here.
I don't want to be explicit or anything, so we should move to this is an extra question, all right, from Psychology. He said we need an iron culture and on the bench crossover episode.
why not?
Here we are.
And
We're doing it.
when I saw the question, the title already came to my mind. Like, we can discuss the cultural differences in the fitness industry in different places. That would be a great topic, because the culture like adds a lot to the mentality, to the food habits, it's very like big topic we can discuss.
Why not?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine it's difficult to translate some of the like American fitness advice into living in Saudi Arabia or the Middle East broadly. Like there's very different things in the grocery store.
Exactly.
Gym culture is different.
Yep.
Obviously, there's a language barrier. Not that there aren't Muslims around the world celebrating, Ramadan and things
True.
like that, but that's something you guys have to navigate. So I mean, there's a lot that is different, and I'm sure that there's many things I'm like, that's great American. That doesn't actually make sense here. So
all right, Eric, it was a pleasure talking to you. You don't know how thrilled I am and Muhammad is, because this is like it's kind of a dream come true, if you want to be like cringy a bit, but we really appreciate your time and your takes on most of the things we discussed. And we're really happy to see you grow as a person, athlete, and a businessman. And I want you to know that you're an inspiration for both of us, and you have a lot of fans that speak in Arabic. I know you were shocked when Muhammad told you that in Saudi Arabia and Emirates we follow your content, and we have your books like right here as well. But we really appreciate your time, and I want you to tell people where they can find you and what services do you have.
Absolutely. First, let me just say it's a huge honor, and I greatly appreciate you guys taking the time to have me on and also sharing that with me. It really does mean a lot. Sometimes when you put out content, especially online, where you don't necessarily get to interact with people as much as you would in a different era, it kind of feels like you're shouting into the void. So I really do appreciate you sharing that with me. Yeah, you can find me many different places. If you want to get my books, like you mentioned, that's at muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. If you're interested in checking out the monthly research review MASS that I mentioned earlier, that's at massresearchreview.com. If you're interested in coaching, we're reading our articles or doing our courses that are really useful to bodybuilders and strength athletes as well. That's 3dmusclejourney.com. And if you want to see all the other things I do, podcasts, appearances like this, you can follow me at Helms3DMJ on Instagram. And also there's a link to my threads where I post the research updates and some of my more spontaneous thoughts.
All right, we'll put Erik Helms' Instagram under this video. And this was it for today's episode.
Thank you for...
Don't forget to share the episode with everyone you know. Erik knows the drill as well. You have to say these things. It's the YouTube algorithm and stuff. So thank you very much again for your time. وكان هذا على البنش ونشوفكم
في الحلقة القادمة. Peace out.